a legal framework by 12 o'clock tonight, what situation does that start to get? A bit of confusion going on in actual fact. There's no clarity about the government benches at all about this.
No, I thank you for that intervention. That is one of the reports coming through. There are so many reports coming through. They change all the time. But it really underlines the point. It is quite possible, I don't know, that a conclusion will be reached later today that it isn't possible to do a deal by this summit. It may be that that report is accompanied by news of progress. It may be that the suggestion is that the talks go into next week and up towards the date of the 31st of October. The question that the Secretary of State won't answer, he doesn't want to intervene on me, is if that happens and it gets right up to the deadline, is the government's position that do or die we leave? We say, notwithstanding that, we're walking away, we're going without a deal, because we said we would. Or is it the government's position that they will allow time for the talks to continue? And we need an answer on that question. It's a really serious question about the future of our country. And this do-or-die nonsense is not helping anyone. Thank you.
The honourable member for giving way. We all know with the European Union that deadlines sometimes lead to agreements because people have to work to a particular deadline. And if there's never a deadline, all that happens is you're kicking the can down the road and decisions aren't taken. The uncertainty caused by further extension is going to be very, very bad for the economy. Can't we just stick to a deadline and get a deal? Because I think that would be the best thing for Britain.
I take the point about a deadline. I genuinely take the point about a deadline. But the serious question underpinning it is, if it gets up to that deadline, and for whatever reason, the negotiations are going on but the deal isn't ready, what's the position? Is it really the government's position that because deadlines are so important, we will then leave without a deal, walk away from the progress, and crash the country out without it? It is so obviously uncomfortable for the government because they don't want to stand up and intervene on me and tell me what they think the position. I'll give way here, then I will give way behind me.
Right, honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he see the absurdity of his position when he stated that he would do, and I think I'm quoting him, he would do anything to avoid no deal? And yet, every single time he's had a chance to vote for the agreement, he has refused to do so. Does he recognise the absurdity of his position in that regard?
I said from the very start that we should have a meaningful vote on the deal so that we could judge whether it's good enough or not. And we had to fight for that, because the previous Prime Minister was not inclined to give us a vote. We would have had a statement from the dispatch box saying this is the deal. We had to vote, we had to fight for the vote, the right to judge the deal. Well, you say you should have voted for it. That means you vote for any deal. You might as well not have the vote. If the argument is we set out, I'll answer this question, we set out the sort of deal we would support. The previous Prime Minister did not reach out and seek consensus across the House to see whether a deal could be arrived. No, she didn't. She did it after the 31st. She did it after the 29th of March, and everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. And I was in those talks, and they were in good faith, and both sides said that. But everybody recognised that those talks should have happened 2 years before they did. And if they had, there might just have been a deal that could have been supported in this House. And it was the policy of the last Prime Minister not to vote for it. But let me just complete on this answer, because it's important, because it goes to this nonsense that the Acts that we have passed to secure an extension in certain circumstances somehow undermines the negotiations. No measure was taken by this House to prevent no deal until after the 29th of March. Therefore, for 2 years, the negotiations went forward without any safeguard for no deal, and it didn't produce a deal that went through this House. So it's nonsense to suggest that it undermines the talk. I did say I'd give way, and so I will.
I thank him for giving way. Would he agree with me that if, in fact, the government genuinely do mean do or die and are committed to crashing us out of the European Union after 31st of October with no deal, then the Minister, who earlier refused to answer the question put to him by the Chair of the Select Committee about the impact on Northern Ireland farmers, which would be catastrophic, would then perhaps be willing to come to the House to answer that question?
Well, I hope he would come to the House to answer that question and very many other questions that go with it. My judgment call is that no deal fundamentally affects not only that aspect of our economy, but many others, and fundamentally undermines the Good Friday Agreement. And I think there are many members across this House on both sides who would not want to put this country in that position under any circumstances, and therefore even dangling the threat that if the negotiations are still ongoing, we would still leave on the 31st of October on a no-deal basis is absurd. I will give way, and then I am going to make some progress.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Isn't he somehow amazed, as I am, of the quasi-religious mystic veneration of the 31st of October that the Brexiteers have developed? This is a date given to them not from on high, but by Donald Tusk in Brussels, that they now venerate and think is cast in tablets of stone. Their position goes from absurdity to absurdity to absurdity.
My principal position is this, that we did the right thing several weeks ago in passing a very simple piece of legislation that says if by next Saturday, this Saturday, the 19th of October, there's neither a deal nor agreement to no deal, then we should take the safeguard of applying for an extension. And that is the law. It's not actually a debating point in this chamber anymore. It was. We debated it, we passed it, that's the law, and that's what needs to happen on Saturday. Because in my experience, everybody says they want a deal, and I don't doubt the sincerity of that. People want different deals, I accept that, but people genuinely want a deal until they see the detail. This is what happened to the previous Prime Minister. Let me just finish the point, and then I'll take an intervention on the point. The last Prime Minister was supported on the proposition of a deal until she brought the deal back and people looked at it. And then they didn't like it. And so there's a danger at the moment in overreaching where we've got to. We do need to wait and see. We need to see what actually comes back in the text. But what happened last time was the principle of a deal was agreed. The detail then was not agreed when it got back here. And that's why the Act we passed several weeks ago is so important. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. And I understand the point he makes about the front bench, and I understand the absurdity he points out, potentially. But I would like to ask him, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, if he can elucidate for the House exactly what settled Labour Party policy is on a deal which they would accept. And I would hope very much that in the position that he occupies, he should be able to give us a very clear answer that would be backed by all the members of his party sitting behind him.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've stood this dispatch box pressing amendments for a permanent customs union and single market alignment and for a level playing field on workplace rights, environmental rights and consumer rights. Every time I've done it, all but a handful of members on that side of the House have promptly gone into the opposite lobby to me to vote against it. We've now reached a point, and I was asked a question, I'm just going to complete the answer. The 5 propositions around which we could see a deal emerging were set out in a detailed letter from the Leader of the Opposition to the then Prime Minister just before the cross-party talks started. So it may well be that people on this side of the House disagree with what that deal should look like, but the idea that we haven't set it out isn't a fair one. I do think this, though, having got this far, having had 2.5 years of failed deals and division, the only way now to break the impasse is to put whatever the deal is back to the public so that they can make a simple decision. Do we want to leave on the terms that are on offer, or would we not rather remain and break the impasse? And I don't think this House is going to be capable of breaking the impasse without it. I will take an intervention, but I'm going to try and get on.
Right Honourable Gentleman, very much for giving way. And in a spirit of positivity, I just want to probe him slightly further on the point he's just made. Is his position now that he would accept some of the level playing field points that were made in the cross-party talks if they were in the political declaration? Or is that no longer the Labour Party position, and is he committed to a second referendum under all circumstances?
At this stage, any deal that comes back from this government ought to be put back to the public for them to decide whether they're the terms they want to leave on or not. Now, I came to that position slowly myself, because I thought that if there was consensus built over the 2 or 3 years since the referendum, there might have been a deal we could agree along the lines I've suggested. But that consensus wasn't built. Time's gone by. The deal hasn't gone through, and now we're in a position, I think, where we can't break the impasse without going back and asking that question. I hope that question is asked on the basis of, as it were, the best deal that would be negotiated, and I mean by that the one that does least harm to the economy and best protects the Good Friday Agreement, because they're two extremely important red lines as far as I'm concerned. This brings me... I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. He's made a very incisive point, and does he not agree with me that it's actually quite tragic, the mismanagement of this government over the last few years and how they have tried to monopolise the negotiation on such a critical national issue, and their own partisanship has visited this grief on this country in this way, and that's why the only way now to break this deadlock, this impasse and the acrimony that's built up in our country is by discharging it through a public vote.
Well, I do agree. I can't help, I'm afraid, feeling that we had a Prime Minister in 2015 who promised a referendum we didn't need in order to try and hold his party together, and then a Prime Minister who wouldn't reach for consensus because she was calculating the numbers on her own side instead of the numbers across the House. Now we've got a Prime Minister with an absurd do-or-die pledge, which is counterintuitive for not putting the interests of our country first. But let me just make this broader point, because our concern, our central concern in all of this, has been about the extent to which any deal will protect the economy, jobs, rights and security, not the backstop, and not the border situation in Northern Ireland, which is obviously the intense focus of the discussions that are going on at the moment. And that's why we rejected the last Prime Minister's deal. And it looks like any deal the current Prime Minister manages to secure, if he does, is going to be both worse on the backstop and on the wider question. And on the former, the question of the border in Northern Ireland, a summary of proposals were presented to this House on the 2nd of October about that, but they weren't promising, because it looks from that summary as though the government is going back on the commitments it made in the 2017 joint report, and would unavoidably mean physical infrastructure on the island of Ireland. And those proposals lack any credible mechanism to ensure consent of all communities in Northern Ireland, a central tenet of the Good Friday Agreement. And frankly, it was wrong to go down the route of a veto in Northern Ireland in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, which absolutely depends on the consent of both communities for anything that happens under that agreement. Now, if those proposals have changed significantly, I'd ask the Secretary of State to update the House. But we remain cautious, and we will not support proposals that lead to a hard border in Northern Ireland or undermine the Good Friday Agreement. On the wider issue of the protection of the economy, jobs, rights and security, the Prime Minister's now proposals on changes to the level playing field arrangements tell their own story. The 7-page explanatory memorandum that the Prime Minister put before this House says this, I quote, "There is no need for the extensive level playing field arrangements envisaged in the previous protocol." He's made no secret of the fact that what he wants to do is to step off the level playing field arrangements. I remind the House why those arrangements were previously included and so important. Because they ensure the UK cannot deregulate or undercut EU rights and standards. They were always minimum protections. We would have liked them to have been written into the withdrawal agreement. So it's extraordinary and deeply significant that the government now has decided to strip even away these basic protections. And the bigger point is this, because this is not a technical point about what's in or out of this particular deal. It sets us on a course for a distant relationship with the EU and gives the green light to deregulation and to diverge. And that's what this Prime Minister has said is his intention. To diverge is the point of Brexit. And it's really important that we make it clear that that kind of deal, one that rips up the level playing field for those at work, for the environment, for consumers, could never be supported by Labour. It could never be supported by the trade union movement. So if the Prime Minister brings back a deal along these lines, he should have the confidence to put it back to the people in a confirmatory referendum, because such a deal would have profound consequences. And the concern is this, not just the technicalities of the level playing field, although it is a technical question, but the political ramifications. Because once you've decided to diverge from EU rules and regulations, you start down a road to deregulation. And it's obvious where that leads. The focus on trade, on our rights and regulations, will move away from the EU because you move... I'll just finish this point. Once you say, I don't want to be part of those rules or regulations, I want to diverge, you are moving your gaze away from the EU as your most important trading partners, and your gaze goes elsewhere, across the Atlantic, to a trade deal with the United States with obvious consequences for our public services, for businesses, I will in just a minute, and for food and environmental standards and for workers' rights. Now, I know for some members that's always been the key purpose of Brexit. But it is profound because you move away from a European-style economy with a level playing field, strong rights and protections underpinning that level playing field, to a different economic model based on deregulation, low tax and low standards. In short, you end up with an arm's-length relationship with the EU and you end hand-in-hand with the United States. And that is not something on this side of the House we'll ever counter. I did say I'll give way. No.
To the right honourable gentleman in giving way. And I raised this question with him specifically because he was the former Director of Public Prosecutions. When he talks about rights and international attitudes, this House passed the Magnitsky Act with regards to sanctions on those who abuse human rights. We're talking about Britain's place in the world. If the government looks to put forward those rules through Parliament on sanctions against those who violate human rights, will the right honourable gentleman agree with me that in that legislation we should put our values clear, put religious freedom there, put modern slavery there, put freedom of media in that, so we are clear where we stand on those sanctions on those individuals who violate human rights?
Let me just answer that and draw on my experience. Because it is perfectly true that we want to collaborate and cooperate across the world on important issues to us, including modern slavery. And I have paid tribute in part, and I do so again to the previous Prime Minister for what she did on modern slavery. She took it very seriously and put forward serious legislation before the House, which made a real difference not only in this country but across the world. But the most intense work we do, with the best arrangements, are with the EU. On counter-terrorism, we have arrangements in place across the world. Of course we do. But the best and the most intense are with the EU by a country mile. I'll just finish this point. They are far more effective in so many respects. The ability to share intelligence with our EU partners is on a different footing to other countries across the world. The enforcement mechanisms, to take a simple example, if you've got... Every terrorist cell that I ever ended up prosecuting operated across borders. And one of the vital questions in those circumstances, do you have the necessary arrangements to carry out the arrest of that cell and assess its intelligence together as a group? That is available through Eurojust. Do you have a strategy for making sure that your arrests are all carried out at the same time? Do you have a protocol for deciding where the prosecution will take place so that it's likely to be most successful? And equally, do you have rules about whether evidence captured in one country can be used in the other? All of that is available to us as a member of the EU. All of that falls away, particularly on a no-deal Brexit. Technical it may be, save lives it did in huge numbers. I will give way.
On the subject of intelligence, the right honourable gentleman knows full well that our many intelligence allies under Five Eyes are not actually within the EU. But he makes an important point. Of course it's important we continue to share intelligence on everyday matters with the EU, and I, for one, do not believe that the EU will not want to do that. Otherwise, the United Kingdom will be the weak link in their chain. But he makes, if I might say so, a fundamental mistake when he presents his argument as a binary choice in terms of trade between the EU and the US, thereby neglecting about two-thirds of the world, including some of the fastest emerging markets in the world, which are not in the EU, and they're not the US, the Commonwealth countries, and other countries further afield. Those are where our future markets lie.
Firstly, on the question of security, I well understand the Five Eyes arrangements in terms of intelligence sharing. But even with the Five Eyes countries, we've got problems with extradition. I did many extraditions to the US. They take years. They're hugely complicated. The evidence has to be tested in a different way here before you can extradite someone to the US, and vice versa. And sometimes you can't extradite because there are conditions around it. Compare that with EU extradition, which takes days. We had bombings in London, as we all know, the 7/7 bombings. We forget that 2 weeks after that bombing, there was another attempted bombing, which only didn't succeed because the explosives devices were damp. 5 of them. And one of the individuals who tried to detonate a bomb in Shepherd's Bush ran off to Italy. And we had him back here within 60 days under the EU extradition arrangements. He was then tried in Woolwich, and he's now serving 40 years. That is what happens under a European arrest warrant and extradition. We don't have those arrangements with the Five Eyes countries. We simply don't. And I'm not doubting the intelligence side of it. I'm talking about the practical enforcement of counter-terrorism measures. That is the reality of it. Is why this do or die will leave without a deal is so wrong for our country. I will give way.
The right honourable gentleman is making a great speech, but I would ask him: isn't there a huge question mark over the Schengen Information System, the largest database in the world? And if we don't have access to that, our citizens will be under threat.
I do agree with that, and that chimes with what I was saying. I think there was a second part of the challenge that was put to me that I haven't yet addressed, which is surely our future lies elsewhere other than trading with the EU. I don't accept that. What is this argument? That somehow not trading with the countries that we trade most with, and just, well, maybe if I finish, you can then come straight back in. The EU, through EU trade arrangements, we have access to another 67 countries. So the best part of 100 countries are available to us through EU membership because of the trade deals the EU has done. So you've got the original 27. Just let me finish the point and then you can shout at me. Why wait? It might be worth waiting. 27 countries we directly deal with as a result of the customs union single market in a most effective way, and every business in the country that trades with Europe says they're excellent relations. Through the EU membership, we have another 67 countries that we deal with on EU trade agreements. That's nearly half the world. So this argument that somehow there's a brilliant tomorrow out there that's got nothing to do with the brilliant arrangements we've got in place is something I've never seen evidenced or argued. In fact, I looked through the government's impact assessments when finally we're allowed to see them for evidence that these new trade agreements were going to make up for all the loss, and it wasn't there. The government's own assessment said we'll be worse off as a result of leaving the customs union. I will give way.
Sorry for missing the very beginning of the debate, but I had a meeting with the Aviation Minister. I want to go back to his point about he believes that this is a very bad deal for workers' rights and so on. And I completely accept that is the Labour point of view, and it should be put to a referendum. I accept that is their point of view. If it were to be put to a referendum and the public voted for that deal, even though the Labour Party feel it's not the deal they would like, and then there were to be a Labour government, would they implement that deal? Because it is important to know that even if they disagree with the deal, because there's going to be a huge amount of legislation that will go with any deal, that they would deliver the deal despite their misgivings about the deal.
Thank you for that question. Let me be clear about my position. I think if we go down this road of having a referendum, and it must be between a negotiated deal and Remain, and by a negotiated deal I mean one that the EU would actually sign off, because I don't think it's fair to people to offer an option to leave that isn't a proper option. I would go further than that. I would advocate in this House that we actually pass the implementation legislation, subject to a coming into force date or something like that, to show that it could be done straight away, because I think we would have to show it had been secured with the EU and therefore could be delivered, and also that we'd already put in place the means to deliver it in this place, so we could actually resolve this one way or the other within a short period of time. And I now think it's the only way to break the impasse. I'm going to make some progress, and I have taken a lot of interventions. But that is the approach we take on this side, and that is because we believe in international cooperation and in upholding international law, and that we need to work alongside our closest and most important allies. And let me just take one example of that: climate change. I listened very carefully to what the Secretary of State said. This Queen's speech has 22 bills. Yet what was there actually on climate change in the speech? One mention in the final paragraph. Yet the climate emergency should be the issue around which our politics evolves and revolves. It is the foreign policy challenge of our time. It's the defining issue of global security. And it should be the focus of the UK's diplomatic and development efforts. It should have been the centrepiece of this Queen's speech, not Brexit. And I think the fact that it got just one mention is a measure of the government's lack of leadership on this central issue. So, Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech was entirely unnecessary. It's packed with bills that the government knows are never going to get passed. It fails to recognise, let alone tackle, any of the huge challenges we face, and shows the government is oblivious to the need for radical change. And frankly, it's the weakest defence imaginable for the decision to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks, which was unlawful and obviously unnecessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
My words, Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. 7 minutes, thank you. I welcome the Queen's speech and the range of bills which the government have put forward. I prefer we weren't having a Queen's speech and that I'd be knocking on doors in Poole at the start of the general election. Because clearly it is true that there is an impasse in this Parliament, and it's largely caused by people who said one thing at a general election and have moved in their position. And I haven't, because actually I think honouring the referendum is a matter of honour. And it's what we said in our manifesto, what I said in my election address in a moment, and it's what all the parties actually said, that they'd honour the referendum. And people voted to leave for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And it wasn't actually conditional on anything in particular. But I happen to believe that a deal is probably better, because I believe in a managed exit is probably going to be less difficult. And if we have a transition, I think the important thing is to have a transition, then that gives some time to have a trade agreement. And the trick with all of this is to maintain the best possible trade arrangement with the EU, whilst opening up opportunities for other countries in the world. And short term, the EU is more important. Longer term, other countries may be more important. But I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and he's mentioned referendums there, and can I just give him the good news, the breaking news in fact. The First Minister of Scotland from Aberdeen has announced there will be a referendum in 2020, and the referendum is going to be in Scottish independence, and we welcome that on these benches.
Last year, and you said that every year.
The simple truth of the matter, though, is that we always knew that a deal produced by the government would be a compromise. And I think it unfortunate that the previous deal, although it had major faults, wasn't passed. And I hope that the government makes some progress with the talks this week, and perhaps a little later in the week that we have some good news. Yeah. Certainly, I think that engaging with the European Union, which the current Prime Minister is doing, is a good thing. I think the EU have proved a little bit more amenable for further discussions than perhaps one might have thought earlier in the year. And I hope we make some progress. But as I said on my intervention to the Honourable Member, I actually think deadlines are what make progress. What gets the attention of the European Union is a deadline creeping up. I think they must be thoroughly fed up with us, as we're fed up with extensions and further negotiation and endless Brexit. But I think we do have to come to an end point. And where I disagree with the Honourable Member, and I understand his point and where he stands at the moment, is that, of course, a confirmatory referendum would probably take the spring at the earliest. That's another 6 months. We in this chamber have a lot of discussion about money, resources. Well, that would mean us continuing for another 6 months paying into the EU budget. It would mean that there would be less money within the UK budget for paying for some very important things. So I hope we get a solution which is an agreement, and I hope it's put to this House. I don't think another referendum is the right way, because actually I do think there is a fundamental democratic point, which is to carry out a referendum which is given to the British people. And having a second referendum before we implement the first referendum, I think would be cause my constituents, I think, great anger. But everybody takes their position, and I've admired the way the Honourable Member has manoeuvred and going forward and backwards. And he had a long speech today. He did take many interventions, but that's when you don't have very much to say, and you don't really have a position, and the position may change. And I think from an opposition point of view, brilliant. But from a point of view of our country, I don't think that's the best position. I think the opposition have to come down on a definite position at some point. In terms of the bills in the speech, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I welcome the immigration bill and the end of freedom of movement, but that doesn't mean reducing immigration. It means actually setting immigration It means control and setting immigration at what's appropriate for the British economy. And I hope we remain an open, confident country taking our part in the world. And our history and our tradition, our language means all of that. The Secretary of State for DFID made some very important points. If our aid budget teaches girls to read, they can read a medicine bottle. They can teach their children to read. It's a major game changer in terms of the world, and Britain is at the forefront of doing it. And it's because, actually, the focus of Britain is worldwide, and the focus of some European countries is actually rather narrower, is why we have a larger aid budget and why people appreciate it around the world. I welcome the Fisheries Bill. I think that it gives a great opportunity for us to revitalise our fishing industry, and I think that's very important to bring forward. Financial Services Bill, I think, will make a major impact. The Medicines and Medical Devices Bill. It is true that despite the great success of our NHS, sometimes we're quite slow to innovate. We're quite slow sometimes in terms of drugs and medical devices. And whenever I've known somebody come up with a new idea, it tends to get trialled and then retrialled and then retrialled and retrialled rather than implemented. So I think there's a lot of progress that we can make. The government's commitment to mental health and social care reforms, I think, are remarkably good. I think the further consultation on victims' law, I think, is very important. I think all of us are very concerned about what we're doing for victims. And, of course, many of us have pensions, and many people have lots of little different bits of pensions, and I think pensions, more information and a dashboard, I think is quite important for people to make long-term choices. I also support what the government is doing on a voter ID. When I collect a package from the Royal Mail or from various bodies, I have to produce ID. And I think for a very important prospect of voting, I think it's not unreasonable for people to produce ID. Whether or not the focus of passport or driving licence is too narrow and it ought to be a little bit wider, maybe a council tax bill or something, I don't know. But I think this is a matter of the debate to be had, because there is a lack of confidence in some of the way elections are conducted within our country. As a nation, I think we've got so much to be proud of. Sometimes we ourselves don't stand up for our own interests and don't actually blow our own trumpet. But I think the government have a good record. I think we have provided a very good base, which is a successful economy. And because of that, we're able to spend a little more money in key areas. I hope we can resolve Brexit sooner rather than later. And I hope we can therefore get back to a proper domestic debate on all the important issues like health and education and transport and everything else. But I actually fully support the government's Queen's speech, and I hope it gets the support that this House ought to give it.
Stephen Giffins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, sometimes easy to forget the sunlit uplands. The sunlit uplands of days gone by when those of us in Westminster weren't entirely immersed in the omni-shambolic bourach that is Brexit. In old money, I'd still be a first-term MP rather than one facing a third general election in just over 4 years. Also in those days gone by, I would have also expected that if a new government were to come in with a fresh set of ideas, let's say to take us out of the European Union, upending decades of peace, stability and progress, in days gone by you might expect them to have some idea of how to deliver that and how to deliver their promises and what impact it might have on us all. Well, 2015 seems like a long, long time ago.
Long time.
Not so long ago, to be fair, that the same old faces who proposed leaving the EU without any sort of plan and how to deliver on their commitments once again find themselves in senior positions of government where they can act on their commitments once again. Plus ça change, plus la même chose, as you might say in the francophone parts of Brussels. So here we are, years on from the EU referendum, and those who failed to deliver on their Brexit commitments the first time round look like they're going to fail a second time around as well. What a mess. What an almighty mess. We're now hearing that reports of election leaflets from the Conservatives accept that we won't leave on the 31st of October. Yep. Quite right too. It's the law. And let's hope that Conservative headquarters are a little bit better at sticking to the law than the Prime Minister appears to be.
Well said.
The UK Government's own analysis tells us that every type of Brexit will leave us worse off and poorer as a result of leaving the EU. Right. Every type. We're healthier with the cooperation in medicine supplies and groundbreaking research for membership. We're wealthier with access to the world's biggest single market. We're fairer with workers and parental and other rights that I would not trust this or any other Tory government with. And we're greener in tackling the climate emergency and technologies where Scotland is leading the way, even if this government doesn't always give us the powers that we fully need. And of course we can do better. Deepening cooperation between 28 independent and sovereign states, because members of the EU are independent and sovereign, let's not forget, is never easy. And on that very point, I'll gladly give way to the honourable member.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. Having heard the news about the proposed referendum on independence from his honourable friend, suppose that referendum did actually take place, and suppose it was carried in the affirmative, would he then turn around and say that Scotland would not leave the Union of the United Kingdom unless it could secure a deal with the rest of the United Kingdom?
This is the most extraordinary thing. They sit here with no plan for Brexit, demanding all sorts that they cannot deliver, telling the people of Scotland to, time and time again, provide a majority to the party who believe in independence, forgetting that there are 27 models throughout the European Union for member status that was also set out before the referendum in a white paper. And I'll say to the honourable member, and I like the honourable member, might not thank me for that, I like him, but what he fails to remember is that it's traditional in democracy to set out your plans before the vote, rather than 4 years later scrabbling about days before you're due to leave, seeking a plan. And the reason for that is independence is normal. Member status of the European Union is normal. Brexit, isolationism, is not normal. So leaving the EU will make us poorer, more decentralised, less fair and isolated from our closest partners. But let us just for one moment focus on one of the proposals, just one, contained in the Queen's speech. Just one. Rarely has there been a more damaging and regressive bit of legislation than that proposed to scrap freedom of movement. A freedom that generations of citizens have benefited from the pensioner who seeks retirement after years of hard work in Spain, to the young person starting out their career in education, getting valuable training or work opportunities in the Netherlands. Mr Deputy Speaker, that was me once upon a time, benefiting from freedom of movement.
Just a young lad.
I didn't benefit from the expensive education that many of the Brexiteers did, but I was able to use it to my advantage to advance my education and career. Opportunities that will now, the UK will now be unique amongst our neighbours and our citizens not having. Why on earth would I vote to take away opportunities that I myself have had? And on that point, I'll give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. On the issue of freedom of movement, I don't know whether the honourable gentleman has noticed in the Queen's speech, they're talking about introducing a new migration system, what they call a point system, where people coming to this country could be directed to a certain location. I wonder what the honourable gentleman thinks about that. That doesn't give you much freedom of movement, does it?
All of this takes away our rights. And if you need any further advice, and the honourable gentleman raises a valuable point, what do we say about the hundreds of thousands of UK citizens who are now desperately looking up long-lost family connections to see if they can get a much sought-after EU passport? Now, I can't blame them for doing so, I won't blame them, and I can understand why they do it. But I do blame this government from devaluing UK citizenship and for nothing. There's been giving up any pretence that any of this is a good idea, any of this benefits us, and freedom of movement sits at the heart of the benefits that UK citizens have had for generations. and freedom of movement that the UK will now be unique amongst its neighbours, unique in not having for our citizens. It is tragic and it is regressive. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, today's debate is Britain's place in the world. Well, Britain's place in the world has rarely been more diminished than it has been by this government today. And I don't even think it's by the people of the UK or those who voted Leave, but it is by the continuing failure of those who sold a Brexit myth and have absolutely no idea how to deliver it. It's even diminished amongst those whom the Brexiteers think will save them from our nearest neighbours. I noted the former Prime Minister Gillard of Australia saying, "I do worry that people are starting to imagine that a trade deal with Australia is somehow a substitute for being on the doorstep of a market with £500 million. It's not." And she's right. And actually, I noticed Canada's Globe and Mail had to express an apology recently because 6 months ago it described government's Brexit policy as a complete omnishambles, saying that things couldn't have gotten any worse. And of course it had the decency to apologise because things did get worse. And at least they apologised for the mistakes that they've made. But the broader mess of Brexit is seen more globally, where the UK has become more and more isolated at a time it needs to work with its international partners. Now, the Minister talked about a leading role in global affairs. Why don't you talk about a global role in global affairs to the Yemenis when we've held the pen at the UN, cannot deliver on the agreement and continue to sell arms to one of the perpetrators of that conflict? This is a government that models itself and its policy on Trump's White House. That's not the international positioning I think the UK government should be looking at. That is not the leadership that anybody should be looking at. And on that point, one final point, I'll give way to the honourable member.
Giving way. Colleagues of his in the SNP were at the Holy See with parliamentarians from across the House at the canonisation of Cardinal Newman, one of our great British saints. Will he assure me of his support as we take forward the work on freedom of religion and belief so that we can work together around the world in promoting that basic fundamental value?
Yes, I absolutely do. And you know, I'll pay tribute to the work that the honourable gentleman has done on that. And we see the devastating consequences where we do not respect one another's freedom of religion or belief, not least in Syria at the moment. And I was fortunate to go with Aid to the Church in Need to the Syrian border, see the good work that's being done there, and also by my own constituents with Sam's House on the humanitarian crisis. And the honourable member has done excellent work on that. And I hope he won't mind me saying a humanitarian crisis made worse by Turkey's actions recently, where I pay tribute to the reporters who are reporting back, and I pay tribute to the humanitarian organisations. And I'll say, as far as these benches are concerned, though I know there's not always unanimity on the government benches, that international aid and meeting that 0.7% is not only necessary and humanitarian, it is a good investment as well. Peace is a good investment. But the UK needs to take a bit of responsibility, and as I mentioned earlier on, should do so over the children, over the British orphans who have been left in Syria, and it needs to do so, and I hope there will be some movement from the Foreign Secretary. But the fall in the UK's international standing is not something any of us should take any pleasure in. I most certainly do not. As somebody who worked in the European institutions, I was able to see at first hand the positives, and I say this as a member of the SNP, the positives that the UK delivered in partnership with other EU member states, leaving as a loss for everybody, but it's particularly a loss for everybody who lives in the United Kingdom. And that's why it's little wonder that increasingly Scotland does not see its future as part of this union, but one in the European Union, where at least that union respects the rights and sovereignty and votes of its members. The UK is a union that likes to say no. No to devolution. No devolution on immigration or business regulation so we can stay in the single market, as called for by the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and others as well. No to freedom of movement. No to more powers so that we can tackle climate change. No giving people a choice over their own future. It does like to say yes. Yes to expensive new nuclear bombs that we don't need. Yes to austerity. Yes to a power grab. And yes to hitting the most vulnerable in society and pursuing the most extreme form of Brexit that nobody voted for. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, no political organisation has an automatic right to existence. The UK Union has no automatic right to existence. And it is increasingly clear that the best thing for everyone in the UK is that we build a real partnership of equals. And that, of course, is only achievable with independence, as Brexit has underlined. Brexit helps nobody, and it's been particularly harmful for relationships with our closest neighbours. But for some time, and today the First Minister is doing the same thing in Aberdeen, we can argue that Scotland can help. As a member state in our own right, Scotland will act as a bridge between Brussels and London, helping rebuild the shattered relationship. That shattered relationship between our most important multilateral relationship and our most important bilateral relationship. That will be good for Scotland as we attract business, research and opportunities while helping our neighbours getting out of this mess. Now, finally, for what it's worth, I don't think this government's extreme right-wing Brexit plans reflects England, reflects our closest neighbours. I don't think this Prime Minister saying that he will break the law reflects England. The way in which England's footballers and manager last night stood up to racism with dignity is reflective of that, not the way that this government has carried out its business. As a very last point, in some ways, this is the same speech that we've been delivering for 4 years on these benches. But the government is still making the same mistakes on the same proposals 3.5 years on. It's time to change.
Hear, hear, hear. Steve Bryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure always to follow the Honourable Gentleman from North East Fife. I agreed with what he said about 0.7% of UK aid. He's dead right. That is one of the great achievements of this government, actually, since 2010. I was interested in his point about working out detail before a referendum has happened, instead of in the last few weeks of it, the detail of that. I wonder whether we will hear the detail worked out from the SNP before their next independence referendum as to whether they will want to keep the pound and what their plan is to keep the pound. I'd be happy to take an intervention from their leader in the House here to hear that.
I'm most grateful, and I have to say I'll commend the honourable gentleman for the tone at the start of his speech. Let me give an absolute cast-iron commitment that when the SNP brings forward its plans for independence, as we will very shortly, we will set out in exact detail the kind of country that we want and have an open discussion with friends and opponents as to what kind of society that we want to live in.
Hear, hear. I take that as no answer on the pound. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I just want to warmly welcome the Queen's speech of yesterday and the fact that we have at last opened a new session of Parliament. With 26 bills to be getting on with as well, so all the more, and of course all the more immediate Brexit endgame stuff to play out. And I won't labour them all, but I just want to touch on a few. As a former health minister, not least, I welcome plans for this independent NHS investigations body, which was talked about when I was in the department, for a new independent NHS HSIB, as it's called, to look into serious healthcare incidents. There's other measures that we're going to bring forward around adult social care and medicines policy. As a former minister in the medicines area, I look forward to scrutinising that. Very much welcome, Mr Deputy Speaker, the ambitious new policies on criminal justice. It was good to hear the Prime Minister yesterday talk about the rehabilitation of offenders during his remarks in the House. And far from the environment being an afterthought in this Queen's speech, I didn't see it that way at all. I'm delighted to see a new environment bill which promises to set legally binding targets to reduce the plastics, to cut air pollution, to restore biodiversity and improve water quality. And as promised, the Animal Welfare Bill to outlaw the proceeds of trophy hunting. I think that's very welcome as well, Mr Deputy Speaker. I only wish we could outlaw the actual act as it happens in other countries, which, if you ask me, shows a darkness in the heart of man, which we should leave firmly in the past. I think these are good measures on the environment. My Green Winchester campaign, which I've run now since before I was elected, will look forward to getting stuck into all of that. I know there'll be a lot of interest from my constituents on it. So I just want to touch on three things, if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker. Firstly, Brexit and citizens' rights, which I've spoken about in this chamber many times since we had the referendum result. In my opinion, Britain cannot have any secure place in the world if it is not a secure place that welcomes citizens from anywhere in the world. And of course it's good news that the Queen's speech contains this immigration bill, and that will make clear resident European citizens in this country and in my Winchester constituency who built their lives in and contributed so much to the UK have the right to remain. Indeed, I note the gracious speech said this bill will include measures that, quotes, reinforce this commitment, which of course is excellent. Now, when the Minister responds to today's debate, I just would like to hear a little bit more about that. So I'm quite clear, and I know many of my constituents will share this wish. This shouldn't be something we're getting round to in late 2019, probably early 2020. The last government, and I know this is something that the Prime Minister said at the time, should have legislated right away to end the uncertainty our EU friends and neighbours living here have felt since June 2016. And I have many constituents who have contacted me to express that view. Secondly, Mr Deputy Speaker, Britain is known for many things around the world, and it's rightly looked up to. As a Health Minister, I was fortunate to represent our country at G7 and G20 meetings, and the experience of travelling wearing that NHS badge. So many countries are envious, and rightly so, of our NHS, and we're probably its harshest critics here domestically, and maybe that's how it should be. But when you talk around the world about the primary care services that we have and the GP service system that we have in this country, the cancer services that we have, the screening programmes that we have, we're the worst country in the world to influence the Fit Bowel Cancer Screening Programme, the immunisation programme that we have in this country. There are many, many things that Britain is rightly looked up to. Now, sure, the 2016 referendum was unusual for us as a country, and we don't need to rehearse all the arguments around how a parliamentary democracy like ours has struggled to reconcile that exercise in direct democracy. But I really do believe we shouldn't overthink how others view us and how this episode has impacted our place in the world. It's been said many times, and I think it's worth repeating, that this House actually represents our country very well right now, divided as it is. And I think we will see on Saturday again how divided our society is outside of this building. Ours is a working democracy, and centuries of precedent and tradition, for my view, don't go bad in the space of 3, albeit feeling like very long years. So I don't, I'm afraid, share the view that we need to tear this House down, find our own founding fathers and write a constitution. Not yet anyway. Surely the challenge of our current impasse has far more straightforward origins. As any student of politics learns, in the first module that they do about the House of Commons, this place works, and the Prime Minister's power derives from having a majority in this place. And whether we like it or not, there will have to be a general election sooner or later. Now, whether that produces a result of any clarity, well, that's another matter. And third and finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, back to Brexit itself. I think we have to be honest and say that Brexit presents challenges and opportunities for Britain's place in the world, but I suspect how depends entirely on how this actually ends. Now, I voted Remain in 2016. I came to the conclusion on that because of the way I see our country as part of something greater than even Great Britain. I'm young, I'm generally internationalist in my outlook. I actually have no issue with freedom of movement. I was a health minister, I saw every day how our NHS needs the supply of labour. I'm actually not hung up on ceding an element of sovereignty to be a member state of the European Union. We do that as a member of other multinational organisations, including NATO, which, after all, has Article 5 as the cornerstone of its foundation, stating that an attack on one is an attack on all. And while I realise this is anathema to some in our country, and maybe even in this House, when I see the British Prime Minister sitting around the table at an EU summit, flanked by the big nations of Europe, and we being a big nation of Europe ourselves, I feel pride, not regret, at that situation. But our country made a choice, Mr Deputy Speaker, a choice we asked it to make. I may regret the results of the 2016 EU referendum, but I respect it, and we must carry it through, and we will make it work. Now, I realise that opponents of moderates have the luxury of taking a position from either end of the spectrum. We have the Brexit Party with its Get Brexit Done and a clean break would just allow us to move on and put Brexit behind us. I think that is just plain wrong. It would resolve nothing and is only a recipe for much further uncertainty. Equally, the Liberal Party's view, and sadly they're not in the chamber, what a surprise, that we can just revoke Article 50 and pretend like Bobby Ewing coming out of the shower in Dallas that it never happened. As one constituent put to me last weekend, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's just not cricket. You have to move forward from where you are in life, not from where you wish to be. So, my view is that Britain's place in the world is strong, and I think it will remain so. It's changing, that's for sure, but I suspect when my children are my age, maybe standing in this house one day, this current time will just be one part of the story that is this ongoing, successful United Kingdom. Thank you.
Indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. If anybody thinks that Brexit has taken too long to get to this point, it's worth just remembering that even if the Prime Minister does get a deal and it's approved by the House, it's going to take a very, very long time as we try and negotiate a new relationship with our biggest, newest and most important trading partners. When one thinks of the list of things to be discussed, trade, services, data transfer, security, scientific cooperation, foreign policy, standards bodies, lots and lots of other things, it is a very long list. And that is why I just say to the front bench opposite, the phrase "get Brexit done" is incredibly misleading, because we haven't even begun to get Brexit done, as the years ahead will prove. Now, things could get worse, which brings me on to the question of a no-deal Brexit, which the Prime Minister said he is prepared to inflict upon the country if the current talks don't reach agreement. The House does not support that. We've heard what it could mean for the Nissan car plant in Sunderland. We know that Vauxhall have said they will not build the new model of their car in Britain if there's no deal. We read about Operation Yellowhammer. And it's just as well that the House voted to require the Prime Minister in those circumstances to apply for an extension, and given the legal assurances that were finally produced by the government in the Court of Session in Scotland, I'm sure the Prime Minister will abide by the law. But for the moment, the talks continue, and whether they are discussions, whether they're negotiations in a tunnel or the tunnel, we can establish some things. Now, the government having said, right, here it is, here's our final offer, take it or leave it, which the European Union said, thanks very much, but that is not the basis for an agreement, the government seems to have moved again, and then again. And frankly, the more we hear about what's being discussed at the moment, the more it reminds every single one of us in the House of the former Prime Minister's customs partnership proposal, because that's what they're talking about now, only applied just to Northern Ireland, which is interesting because the current Prime Minister resigned from his job as Foreign Secretary, saying of the last customs partnership proposal, it sticks in my throat and I can't support it, which merely proves how times change. The reason why it's proving difficult, I think we all understand, because a dual customs arrangement is untested, there are risks of fraud and smuggling, threats to the single market, not clear what consent mechanism Stormont may have. It's all very complicated. And therefore we have to face up to the possibility, Mr Deputy Speaker, that all we'll get out of the summit this week is the EU leaders noting that some progress has been made and looking forward to further talks, in which case we are, in all probability, heading for a further extension anyway. We know also that the backstop is essential because we have to maintain that open border. And the Prime Minister got himself into trouble when he announced that he wanted customs checks in Northern Ireland, which was never going to be acceptable to the European Union, and breached the solemn commitment that the previous government had given to the European Union in the joint declaration that under all circumstances there would be no checks, no infrastructure, no controls, which is a commitment embedded in the 2018 EU withdrawal act. Yes, of course I will give way.
I'm giving way, and the issue of tariffs is very much on the minds of farmers in my constituency, who I met last week. And the government seem to be dodging the answer to the question about what it actually will mean for farmers. I'm told huge tariffs and a devastation for our farming industry. Would I care to comment on that?
Well, I would, and it was very noticeable that when I put the point to the Minister earlier about the evidence that we received this morning from the Ulster Farmers Union, the one-word answer was simple: catastrophic. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why any government would wish to impose upon that industry, never mind all the other industries, an outcome which it knows would be catastrophic. What is the possible justification for that? There is none, which is why the House was right to act to safeguard. Yes, indeed.
I really appreciate the member giving way, because it is important that the catastrophic issue is clarified. Because I met with the Ulster Farmers Union today also, and he did not imply it in the way I think the honourable gentleman is referring it to the House. What he did say is that it's clear what would be catastrophic would be if tariffs were only in one direction, and he encouraged the government to let the Republic of Ireland know that if they put tariffs on Northern Ireland products moving south, then the government here should reciprocate. That, in his words, would soon sober the Republic of Ireland up.
Well, I'm merely reporting to the House what the witness said to us today. It is the policy of the government that there would be no tariffs coming this way across the border in Northern Ireland. But of course, as we know, the EU would impose tariffs on goods, including agricultural products, going the other way. That is the policy of the government. In a few days' time, if there is no agreement, and thank goodness the House has prevented that from happening. The other thing I want to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, is there's been very little discussion so far of what really matters, which is the future economic relationship. Because whatever the details of the backstop, you're going to have a backstop. And the Prime Minister has said he's in favour of a Canada-style free trade agreement. Now, what does that mean? It means, in our relationship with our biggest and most important trading partners, there would have to be customs checks, there would have to be checks on standards, there would have to be checks on rules of origin. At the moment, there are none, because we're both in the single market and the customs union. And we know how many businesses have built their success on the absence of those checks. And that is why last week we heard 5 really important sectors saying how bad for them and for their businesses and their employees a Canada-style free trade agreement would be. And remember, the CETA deal does not eliminate all tariffs. It has inferior access to the single market, and there is no mutual recognition. And we learned last week or the week before, HMRC said if you're going to have to fill in customs declarations, it's going to cost British businesses about £15 billion a year. We wouldn't be in things like the Aviation Safety Authority or the Chemicals Agency, which is so important to common standards. And unless you had a backstop, it would, of course, lead to a hard border in Northern Ireland. And the other thing the government said was that it was moving away from the commitment to a level playing field. And that came as a great shock, because how exactly do ministers expect to get good quota and tariff-free access to the EU when the United Kingdom is saying to them, well, as your nearest and most important trading partners, we might seek to undercut you as our neighbours because we will have different standards and different regulations, even though we want to carry on trading with you. And I don't think that is going to work. And therefore, I hope the government is listening, because, let's be frank, a Canada-style Brexit would be a hard Brexit, it would be a backward step for the economy, and the government's own assessment shows it would have the worst impact on the economy, second only to a no-deal Brexit. Now, the final point I want to make, Mr Deputy Speaker, is this. Here we are meeting on Tuesday. We've no idea what we're going to have presented to us on Saturday. We haven't seen any papers, no draft text, no political declaration. And yet, I think there is a growing number of members of the House who have come to the view that the only way, in the end, to resolve this question and to gain consent on the way in which leaving happens, if that is what to take place, is to go back to the British people. Now, I know the government has said that under no circumstances will we agree to a confirmatory referendum, but let's be honest, there are lots of other things the government has said during the course of this Brexit mess that they would never do that they are now doing. Who knows what they're doing in the negotiations as we speak. And I would argue that going back to the British people does represent the compromise position in British politics, because over here is the government arguing that it is prepared to inflict the damage of a no-deal Brexit on the nation. Over here are those who argue that the referendum result should just be cancelled, scrapped, because that is what permanent revocation would mean. And that is why, Mr Deputy Speaker, the moment of truth is approaching for the House. And I believe that we will need to enlist the help of the British people in order to do so. Not to get Brexit done, but to decide whether to remain or to go ahead, and if so, how. And I have never wavered from my belief that Brexit is profoundly wrong for the future of our country and its place in the world. And I say that as an optimist, because the Prime Minister has no monopoly on optimism about our country. The question is whether the British people have changed their minds. Now, I don't know whether they have. The Prime Minister doesn't know. The House doesn't know. So let's ask the people, because they will know.
Chris Bibler. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable gentleman. It's a pleasure indeed to be called so early in the debate, Mr Deputy Speaker. Indeed, and some of the debates we've had on the European Union, it's been a pleasure to be called at all, particularly reflecting on the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the last Parliament. I perhaps know only too well, with my successor in his place, the cost of being a Brexiteer in this Remainer Parliament. But I'm very proud of some of the work we did as a committee then in analysing not only our future relationship with the European Union, but bringing home 3 select committee reports on the vexed issue of Europe unanimously, with a committee that was split down the middle on the issue. And perhaps one of the ones that was, I think, most important was done in advance of the referendum on the implications of the referendum on EU membership for the UK's role in the world. And given the subject of today's debate, Britain's place in the world, I think there should be more focus in this debate on what our future role in the world is going to be, having left the European Union. Now, of course, I understand, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there is a rearguard action of huge ferocity and determination going on in order to reverse the decision that people took in the referendum in 2016. And, of course, I'm only too happy to give way to the...
And I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way, but I have to pick him up just on this. As somebody who never voted for Article 50, as somebody who wants to remain in the European Union, this does not feel like a Remainer Parliament to me. If it were, we would not be in this situation because we'd revoke Article 50, as the Court said we could do tomorrow.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes clear the position that there is an awful lot going on in the smoke on this issue, where people are not being precisely clear and honest about the precise position they're taking. Now, I exempt the Liberal Democrats, I exempt the Scottish Nationalists from that position. However, the Honourable Gentleman, I note, and his amity for me is fully reciprocated, and I'd rather suspect mine might do him more damage than his will do to me, in the question on no deal. And the idea that Scotland, if its vote was allowed another referendum by this Parliament, and it then, because this Parliament would have to pass it, and we dealt with this issue for a generation, I might want to point out to the Honourable Gentleman, as he well knows. But if there was a future referendum, and Scotland voted to be independent, there would then need to be a negotiation about the terms of Scotland leaving the Union of the United Kingdom. And the idea that he would come here and say that if the rest of the United Kingdom would not come to an agreement, that then it would all be off, is utterly preposterous. And it's exactly the same relationship that he has voted for to impose on the United Kingdom in its negotiation with the European Union. And finally, because we now actually have a date in mind, stated of the 31st of October, we are now getting the necessary concentration from our partners to finally get serious about the terms of that withdrawal agreement. And I might just reflect that we have heard a great deal from the Taoiseach and the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Ireland in the years that led into this negotiation. Finally, into the debate came the Finance Minister a couple of weeks ago, audibly into the debate. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I take the entry, in that sense, of financial reality, the implications of there to be no withdrawal agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union, of the entry into the discussion of the Finance Minister of the Republic of Ireland as a thoroughly good sign that we're now going to get serious as we run into the final stages. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the member for giving way. Indeed, I think his observations are very telling about what has happened in the Republic of Ireland, the sobering up of some people's views. He will recall, as I do, that since the withdrawal agreement came into existence, this House has been told it is unalterable, it is sacrosanct, it cannot be changed. What's been happening since the smiling meeting in the countryside of England last week? It is being changed. An amazing turn of events.
It is an amazing turn of events given the language it was used about the withdrawal agreement. I entirely agree with my honourable friend. But of course the reality is it's not that amazing because interests are finally entering properly into this discussion. And the interests of twice as many people in the European Union are engaged in the economics of the outcome of, if there was no agreement, than there are in the United Kingdom. Now, as the Foreign Affairs Committee said on our inquiry into the implications of no deal, it is, of course, going to be a greater proportion of the UK's economy, but there are more people on the other side of the Channel and on the other side of the Irish Sea who are going to catch the consequences if we fail to succeed in the rest of this week of successfully bringing home a withdrawal agreement. And I then have to say to the Labour front bench, in the absence of the Shadow Secretary of State, that the presumption that the nobility of purpose of defending the Good Friday Agreement is why no deal must be taken off the table is false as well. Are our fellow members of the European Union actively going to work, once we've left the European Union, to undermine the Good Friday Agreement and the relations between Northern Ireland and the Republic? Of course not. And that's why we need to turn to the future and what Britain's place in the world will be after this. Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, what we've only done in the withdrawal agreement is deal with the terms of the withdrawal. What has to be settled is, of course, the future arrangements and relationship with the European Union. And there I trust that that negotiation will be rather better dominated from the beginning with the common interests that both the EU and ourselves have in a constructive trading relationship that gives us the opportunity then to forge a new relationship with the EU, but based on a new role in the world for the UK. And the country made its choice between being part of a big bloc or being a nation of 65 million people on its own. And I think the choice it made, in the interest of the long-term interests of the UK, given the direction that the European Union was going, was the right one. And it's that role in the world that we must convince our children of the merits of. And the Secretary of State for International Development, in opening this debate, reflecting on his visits around the world and how the United Kingdom is seen, focus on the values the UK is seen to uphold: democracy, the rules-based system, economic empowerment of people. And of course the one he didn't mention, which I think is one of the golden threads, is of course the respect for the law. It is why London is the place where so many international companies will have their agreements judged and under English corporate law, because our judges and are trusted, and our system is seen as fair. And that is an English set of values that are then seen as a global asset that are associated with England and the United Kingdom down the centuries, a sense of proper fair play. Now, in explaining Britain's new role in the world to the generation of younger people who voted to remain in the United Kingdom, thinking that voting to leave was somehow turning our back on internationalism. It is quite the reverse. The United Kingdom now has the opportunity to play a role in the world as a member of the United Nations Security Council, contributing properly to our security and defence through NATO, but as a development superpower, making that commitment as a serious economy of 0.7% of our GDP on development, actually to put forward our values in action across the world and be a global leader in every sense for the best values of humanity. And an example, Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. These are truly uncertain times. We do not know what the outcome of the ongoing talks with the European Union shall be. We don't know if the measures contained in Her Majesty's speech will receive the approval of this House. We do not know or when we will be facing a general election contest whereby the content of this speech and other speeches, rather than being a legislative programme for a sitting Parliament to discuss, amend or scrutinise, transforms into the basis of a future Conservative manifesto. I welcome the fact that Government has outlined its planned programme and that this House will have over the coming days the opportunity to debate and scrutinise the Government's intentions. Britain's place in the world is the title of this debate. I want to welcome what the Minister said in relation to the commitment to education across the world for every young girl and woman. The issue, as others have referred to, the issue of MGM to be addressed, the issue of access to the best health medications to prevent TB and typhoid and HIV and all the other things that come with that there. And this Government has given that commitment, and I welcome that. I do want to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that I'm concerned about one thing that's been omitted, and it referred to the Armed Forces veterans. I wish to take this opportunity to express my disappointment that has not been included. Mr. Deputy Speaker, many people from up and down the length of this United Kingdom are deeply uncomfortable with the pursuit of elderly Armed Forces veterans for actions undertaken when serving in Northern Ireland. Government should have taken this opportunity, because I believe it's the will of this House, cross-party support to protect those people. Since the signing of the Belfast Agreement, people from all quarters have had to swallow hard and accept the release from prison of people who were guilty of the most horrendous crimes after serving a mere fraction of their jail sentence. In that context, it is very wrong to see soldiers who were only ever in Northern Ireland to prevent the place descending into anarchy being hounded in their old age. It is my sincere hope that the Government will deliver very soon how they intend to protect those who serve the community and help to deliver the peace. For me, it's really, really important Government has admitted to do that, even though they have given a commitment to myself, to others, and on both sides of the Houses for that to happen. In relation to Brexit, I welcome the commitment outlined by the Government to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation. As a representative of a constituency, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in which fisheries have been at the sharp end of policy decisions taken in the halls of Europe, it is my sincere hope that we will soon have control over the fisheries policy back in British hands. Over many years under the common fisheries policy, the industry has contracted sharply. In my constituency of Strangford and the fishing village of Portavogie, we now only have 40 boats in the harbours, whereas some 15, 20 years we had almost 100, and going back further even more than that. So the Government have put forward legislation which will bring the licensing power after the UK leaves the EU. Foreign boats will no longer have automatic access to UK waters. That's what I want to see, that's what Government wants to see, and I think the quicker that happens, all those who represent fishing villages across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will welcome that as a true policy, and the rest of it I'm very happy to carry.
But doesn't he also realise that his fishermen and majority of fishermen in the UK rely on access to the single market with the biggest... so any no-deal Brexit would actually be devastating for them. And it's also wrong that actually, if we had a no-deal Brexit, that our waters would be closed off overnight because of international treaties through the UN. We'd have to then negotiate those deals with individual nations.
thank the honourable gentleman for the intervention. I would have a contrary opinion to that, but he probably expects me to say that anyway. And the reason why I have it, because I have confidence in the fishing sector and what they can do. The product that we sell, and I use the example of Portavogie prawns, Gilkeel prawns, our glass prawns are sold all over the world. They're sold because they're the best quality product and because they want it. So are those markets going to close just because the fisheries will not have access to these? No, they aren't. And I want to fix that there. They still want the product, they will pay for the product, and they'll make sure they have access to it. Government has also committed themselves, and I welcomed this yesterday, in subsidies that reward farmers for biodiversity. I declare an interest as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union, so the honourable member who referred to the Ulster Farmers Union, who he spoke to today, and my honourable friend for Northampton, who also spoke to him, I can tell you that as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union, my neighbours, who are all involved in the dairyman, dairy sector, I should say, all wish to leave the EU, and they look forward to the future. Now, government has given a commitment to ensuring that some of those tariffs, some of those subsidies, some of those grants will be in place as long as they have the wherewithal to do that. Lakeland Dairies in my constituency have 2 factories in Northern Ireland, 2 factories in Southern Ireland, and that milk product will cross the border on a number of occasions. So again, the future for us is very bright. I welcome the government's commitment to the NHS and health, that minor ailments can be referred to pharmacies, and that will take some of the pressure off the GPs, the doctors and the nurses. I welcome the government's commitment to law and order, but also to the obligation of government to ensure the safety and security of the people whom it serves. And I particularly welcome the prisoners' disclosure of victims. Because we just last week in Northern Ireland had a man who was convicted of the murder of a lady who disappeared some 6 to 7 years ago, and I believe it's imperative that we have in place a law that says if you have murdered someone, if you don't disclose that, then you get more years in prison. Government has given a commitment to bringing that in as legislation. I know the families want to see that happen. I want to see it happen, and it's good news. In the building safety standards, again, good news for what government is bringing forward new laws to implement new building safety standards. In Northern Ireland, we have some 33 tower blocks. It's a devolved matter, I understand that, but the fact that we had a fire just shortly after in Dunmurry, shortly after the Grenfell disaster, I think knocked home to us and made us very aware of the need to have legislation in place. I very much welcome the HII inquiry and the compensation that will come out of the back of that for those victims who have been abused over the years. I also welcome government's commitment to broadband and to make sure that the connections are in place. Now, we have a confidence and supply agreement with the Conservative Party, and through that there was a delivery of broadband, and we want to see that continue. But I'm very happy to, yes.
Right honourable friend for giving way. Does he welcome that next week Northern Ireland will benefit from a visit from the Australian High Commission, where there will be talks with Invest Northern Ireland and other important groups about future relationships and trading opportunities that will now be open for Northern Ireland as a result of being free post-Brexit, and that the following week the Singapore High Commissioner will also be in Belfast for similar talks with Invest Northern Ireland and political leaders. Does he recognise that that actually opens up Northern Ireland having an even greater place in the world than is the present case?
I thank my honourable friend and colleague for that intervention. Yes, I do welcome that. And I'm not surprised either that we have good times coming and the sun will shine again. And it won't be in total darkness, as some people seem to say all the time. But if they can do the deals with Australia and with Singapore and with others, as governments committed themselves to, then we can do that. I mean, the Minister for International Trade secured and helped to secure a deal for milk products from Lakeland Dairies in Newtownards for £250 million over 5 years. So things can happen. The life doesn't stop because we're going to leave the EU. In relation to employers and tips, and this is a very quick one, I just want to say I totally feel that tips are, after all, a form of performance-related pay. And if governments suggesting, as they seem to be, that staff serving in a public house or a restaurant have performed their role so well that a person gives them additional payment for doing so, then it's only natural justice that they should enjoy the full benefit of that. And I hope that the measure that's put forward again by government will be one that we can look at. Voter ID, and this is one that came up yesterday in an intervention on the far side. We in Northern Ireland have already had voter ID in place for a number of years. It was there for a purpose. It was there to ensure that corruption and illegal voting that was taking place was stopped. And it did go a long way to doing that. Wasn't it just very quickly, yes.
So in Woking, we've had voting ID pilots the last couple of years. And would the honourable member agree with me that the scaremongering that's going on about these successful pilots and what would, I'm sure, be a successful rollout are just so much piffle and nonsense?
I agree that voter ID is one of the things that we should be looking forward to. I welcome government's commitment to it. Don't be scared of it, because ultimately the ID is there for yourselves to use for getting bank accounts for I mean, wherever you are in the world, you open a new bank account, you get a driving licence, if you go to your shop to open an account, you'll have to show some sort of ID. So don't be scared of the idea of ID. Now, ID has functioned well in Northern Ireland. We have not entirely eliminated electoral fraud in the province, but we've gone a long way in doing so. We are committed to it. We're committed to the democratic process. We're committed to voter ID, committed to supporting government and the majority of things that they have in forward. Far-reaching set of proposals. But I can say this, that we look forward to engaging with ministers.
Order, Sir George Holmgren.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's my pleasure to speak for the first time in any Queen's speech or on the gracious speech during my career in Parliament. It's not something I've done before. I'm going to focus very narrowly, if I may. I'm going to talk about the trade bill which has been put back into this gracious speech, which of course made its way through certain parts of Parliament in the last session. Now, I have to say, when I look at the outline of it, it all looks, well, moderately familiar. One might even say Groundhog Day. We need measures to adopt the provisions of transition agreements, set up the TRA, accede to membership of the GPA and collect data about importing and exporting. Well, that's pretty much what the last one did. And I would hope that this time round, certainly those core parts of the bill, were it to come forward, if it comes forward, if we need it to come forward, will pass both houses reasonably quickly. Plainly, we have succeeded rather more than I think opposition parties thought we would in renegotiating the terms of EU trade agreements into a UK form. Some 70% of those now on the books. And we also know that actually most of those agreements, because they have been passed by the EU and adopted by the EU and adopted by us, have most of what they need on UK books anyway. So I don't believe that those measures should be particularly contentious. The Trade Remedies Authority is something that operates in a shadow form within government at the moment, and that cannot be the right way of handling things. The Trade Remedies Authority is incredibly important to us, in all of us in this House, in the context of a trade policy for the long term. Labour members particularly, who represent industrial constituencies, who look at unfair competition from abroad, for ceramics, for steel, for building materials, should be very keen to see this provision on the books. World Trade Organization rules on this are extremely complex. They demand enormous amounts of evidence about the breach of the terms of trade, and quite rightly impose high barriers in the way of restrictions to trade. Part of that is about having a standalone body that can do this, to show independence from government, to show that there are no political issues that these measures that are proposed are satisfying. And I would urge all members to make sure that as and when this bill comes to the House, that they take due regard of the industries which they would want to protect if this bill does not pass with that measure included in it. I would hope after that that the measures to adopt the General Procurement Agreement and our accession to it will be easy for everyone to understand. Access to $1.3 trillion of international procurement opportunities seems to me to be very worthwhile. And the information sharing across government about what people might or might not be exporting is, of course, also extremely important. I would stress now that at least in the last bill, that was a voluntary issue and was there so that exporters and importers knew as much about themselves and their sectors as did government. But that is all in the context of what derailed the bill last time round, and I think we need to be very plain about this. It's very, very clear to me that the rights and responsibilities of the devolved nations are recognised when we start to negotiate free trade agreements. Devolved nations have very clear responsibilities. There are certain parts of trade, certain parts of the economy at least, which are devolved to those nations, that absolutely will have an impact on how we frame free trade agreements. And it is quite clear to me that the devolved governments must have their say as we put together our mandates and as we put together the negotiations with third-party countries. Now, I met with the ministers in the devolved governments several times. I worked extensively in the department to try and ensure that we came up with a decent offer. I believe that offer was the right one, and I hope very much that the department will note that we cannot lose sight of this issue. We work much more strongly and produce much better free trade agreements if we can be sure that the devolved governments will come with us on that journey. And I am convinced that they will, as long as they are treated fairly and properly. Second to that, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is the issue about the way we scrutinise free trade deals in this place. And once again, it's time for the House to look very carefully at itself and at its rules and understand that these are very, very important issues that will bind this country for the long term into arrangements with third-party countries that have effects in the British economy that are not even necessarily directly related to what's agreed in the agreements themselves. What's more, lots of them have 20-year run-off periods. These are not arrangements that can easily be undone, even by this House, even if it wants to do so. And I believe that the command paper that was put to the House of Lords when we brought this bill into the House of Lords last year, that detailed very clear scrutiny mechanisms, a dedicated committee for treaties, backed up again then by the Constitution Committee of the House of Lords itself, recommending that the way forwards that the command paper had outlined was the right one, is the one that the government should be pursuing. I will add this one rider. It does seem to me that in this circumstance, there is still debate to be had about whether CRAG A, the way in which we ratify treaties in this country, is sufficient for free trade agreements, which are a very different sort of international agreement than many, many others. One only has to look at the complexity, the amount of paper that is involved in any one of these agreements to understand that further scrutiny might well be required. Just a few more notes, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the Department itself, and indeed for the House. We must continue to understand that market access, negotiations with third-party governments, out with free trade agreements about difficulties in trading in their countries, are every bit as important, not just in terms of to individual companies, but also to the economy as a whole, for our trading internationally as our FTAs. We must not lose sight that most trade departments dedicate 2/3 of their resource to market access and 1/3 to FTAs. We must take account of the environment and our 2050 targets when we strike new free trade deals. How we can possibly reach our 2050 target if we pursue endless new free trade deals, which endlessly increase GDP, that is, after all, what they are there to do, is a conundrum which the Department and indeed this House will have to crack. On EU negotiations, should we get to a point when we're trying to pursue another trade deal with the EU, please don't forget, please let the government not forget that we have very experienced trade negotiators in the DIT who could well assist. Believe me, that's not been the case so far. And finally, the whole of Africa and our representation through DIT there is paid for by £3 million worth of spending.